And today we are looking at the second of three questions that our catechism dedicates to the sixth commandment. And the question today is, what is required in the sixth commandment? The answer is, the sixth commandment requireth all lawful endeavors to preserve our own life and the life of others. Now, if you recall, when we introduced this commandment last week, we did so with a supposed dilemma. The dilemma being, how do we as Christians who take the Bible seriously explain that on the one hand, God commands us not to kill, and then on the other hand, we have clear cases in Scripture where God is either killing people himself directly or commands others to kill others. And just a spoiler alert, we're going to see it again in our reading next week. Israel is going to go on to kill 12,000 people, men and women, in the city of Ai. This is something that we really need to give some thought to. Because in just about every debate that I have ever listened to involving a Christian versus an atheist, at some point the Christian will oftentimes challenge the atheist on the question of ethics. You know, how do you account for ethics, right and wrong, morality? And the atheist almost always diverts the challenge away by bringing up the fact that we worship a cruel, angry, tyrannical God. And they will appeal to these stories. The popular atheist Richard Dawkins does this over and over again. He never really answers the question as an atheist because he can't. And he knows this. So he draws everyone's attention away by whining about this cruel, angry God of the Old Testament. Sam Harris is another popular atheist who takes a somewhat different approach. He agrees with Richard Dawkins' assessment of the Old Testament, but he'll cut us a little bit of slack by arguing that Christians have evolved over time. Christians, due to pressure from modern society and enlightenment, have adapted to be more modern and enlightened and have gotten away from all of that cruel, tyrannical stuff from the Bible. And then Sam will usually go from there and turn his attention on Islam, which he argues has the same roots as the violence and the tyranny in the Scriptures, but the Muslims haven't learned to adapt. They haven't evolved. They haven't reformed. And sadly, a lot of Christians have bought into this nonsense. They have bought into the false assumption that God radically changed his tune from the Old Testament to the New Testament. They have bought into this nonsense that back in the Old Testament days, God was all about law and wrath, and now in the New Testament covenant days, God is all about grace and mercy. That whole conversation is nonsense because it rests on a false premise, and that false premise being that there is this contradiction in Scripture between either with God killing people directly or indirectly by commanding people to kill versus God commanding us not to kill here in the sixth commandment. And last week, you remember, we considered two reasons why this so-called contradiction doesn't actually exist. First, when you understand the full scope of the sixth commandment in context of the whole Scripture, the commandment prohibits unlawful killings, not an absolute prohibition against any and all taking of life. The second reason we looked at was to consider the presupposition behind the sixth commandment. And we noted there that the Bible never directs us to have this sort of absolute reverence for life simply for life's sake. And let me be clear what I mean by that. What I mean is this. The meaning, purpose, and significance of life is never, ever in Scripture divorced from its religious context. Robert Raymond said it this way in his systematic theology. He says, quote, because man, created in God's image, is homo religiosus, that is, a religious human, even before he is homo sapiens, this wise human. The first obligation of every man is to worship and serve the Creator. So notice, what is the meaning, purpose, and significance of your life rooted in? It's being made in God's image. And why was capital punishment established by God for murderers? Genesis 9:6. For God created man in his own image. But what are the key elements of being made in the image of God? The Westminster Confession of Faith, chapter 4, paragraph 2. After God had made all other creatures, he created man, male and female, with reasonable and immortal souls, endued with knowledge, righteousness, and true holiness after his own image, having the law of God written in their hearts, and power to fulfill it, yet under a possibility of transgressing, being left to the liberty of their own will, which was subject unto change. Beside this law written in their hearts, they received the command not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which while they kept, they were happy in their communion with God and had dominion over the creatures. From day one of man's existence on this planet, the so-called right to life was never inherently absolute to man, regardless of how man lives. Rather, God covenanted with Adam and his posterity, in which God promised life upon what? The condition of perfect and personal obedience. And what did Adam do? He sinned. And what is sin? A lack of conformity or transgression of the law of God. And what did Adam forfeit by his rebellion? Genesis 2:17. Adam, in the day that you eat of the tree that I have forbidden you to eat, well, you have done a very stupid thing, but nonetheless, you will continue living on for as long as you please, because you have this absolute inherent right to life. Is that what the text says? Of course not. You may surely eat of the tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die. Romans 6:23, for the wages of sin, that is the wages of lacking conformity to and transgressing the law of God, is death. You have to keep all these things together. It's a package deal. The meaning, purpose, and significance of life is rooted in your design by the Creator as an image bearer to worship and serve Him according to the law that He gives to us. You cannot divorce life from image bearing, and you cannot divorce image bearing from the law. I don't care what the atheists or libertarians want to argue. When you divorce the law of God from the meaning, purpose, and significance of life, you are no longer talking about a life worth living. Now, you may be asking yourself, okay, we got it. But what about question 68? Shouldn't we be discussing all the ways in which we are to preserve life? Well, I wanted to make sure that you're rooted in this presupposition of life, being rooted in image bearing and the law of God and obedience. Why? Because I want you to notice something very important in our answer today, question 68. What is required in the sixth commandment? Answer: the sixth commandment requires all endeavors to preserve our own life and the life of others. Is that what it says? Did you catch something? No, that's not what it says. That would be the atheistic or libertarian slant on the answer. If you're listening closely, you notice I left one word out. And that one word will make or break you regarding this commandment. That one word will make the difference between you understanding this commandment rightly as a follower of Christ versus you putting some unbiblical libertarian spin on it. And what was that word? Lawful. It doesn't say that the sixth commandment requires all endeavors to preserve life. It says it requires all lawful endeavors to preserve our own life and the life of others. So you mean to tell me, Westminster Divines, that there are cases in which it would be unlawful to preserve life? Well, apparently so. Otherwise, they wouldn't have qualified it. Beloved, the very fact that the divines would rightly qualify your so-called right to life with the word lawful tells us what? It tells you that there is a law and a lawgiver that stands over you. It tells you that you do not have some sort of inherent, absolute right to life. It tells you that your life ultimately is not your own. And despite what the libertarians tell you, this tells you that ultimately your body is not your own to do with it whatever you feel like doing. You are not the sovereign, and you are not a law unto yourself. Think of the massive implications that this has. Think about all the confusion, even among some Christians, that is created over talks of abortion, capital punishment, war, social justice, and so on. Most of which, at least in my experience, stems from a false premise that divorces life from image bearing, and image bearing from God's law and obedience. Think of the implications this may have over the refugee discussion. You have some Christians today arguing for open borders, let everybody in. And they'll even throw in the fact that these refugees are made in the image of God. Okay, but what about the law of God? What place does that have in image bearing? To this day, I've never seen any of those who argue this way bring God's law into this whole discussion. But how can you divorce image bearing from God's law? You can't. Or how about this one? Is there a connection between rejecting the covenant of works or of life in Genesis 2 with a promulgation of an absolute right to life and liberty, including a religious liberty for all false and damnable religions, along with the rejection of the establishment principle in chapter 23 of the original Westminster Confession? I think there's a connection. Well, there are a lot of things to explore with this that we simply don't have time now to explore. But what I wanted to do again was to reinforce the presupposition of the Sixth Commandment with you today, so that you will work from a proper foundation in exploring what all the Sixth Commandment requires and prohibits. Because if you don't, if you divorce a right to life from image bearing, and image bearing from God and His law, you simply will not get it. You will not understand the direction that the divines take and how they answer these questions. You won't understand when you look at the larger catechism's version of these questions. Why do they include so many things in this commandment? I mean, you look at it, everything from how you sleep, to what you eat and drink, to your attitude, to not only what you do with your body, but with your soul. You think about it, virtually the whole of life is covered under this one commandment. Why? Because the whole of life is covered and to be directed under God's law. And we're going to see it again in the next question, Lord willing, if Penrose doesn't call out sick. There, another single word is used that directs the whole meaning of the answer next week. Notice, the Sixth Commandment forbids the taking away of our own life or the life of our neighbor. Does it stop there? Nope. One word is added, changes the whole. It forbids the taking away of our own life or the life of our neighbor unjustly. That makes a huge difference. The divines were far more astute and careful than so many of us are today. And they never, ever divorced a right to life from God and His law, ever. And it's absolutely critical that you understand that. Well, that concludes our lesson for today. And as we said, Lord willing, Hidro will continue our discussion on this commandment. And again, with that presupposition in mind, I hope it helps direct you in helping you understand what is required and forbidden. Well, please stand now as we recite the Ten Commandments.